we've come to the point of trying to define or trying to explore the origin of sin. And we've come to the point of saying that there's an approach that tries to see sin in the nature of things as such, i.e. in matter that's initially sinful. We saw a sort of Pelagian sense, right, that sees sin just in human individual actions, in which case the will is the operative factor. Then we also saw a third option that sees sin in terms of the disposition of a human nature. Now we're going to move a bit forward in this. Particularly, what would you say, for example, to somebody who says, well, we have sin in us in the sense that we have sin is in our flesh. We have a sinful disposition because our flesh is sinful, and then we put forward some of the discourses of Paul, right, where Paul talks about this sort of warring of the spiritual man against the carnal man, for example, the spiritual against the fleshly. For example, in 1 Corinthians 15:39, where he sort of sees, it would seem, the material substance of the human body as sinful. Somebody could please read that for us. Let's get a sense of this idea that sometimes it would seem we get the picture that sin may be something that pertains to the flesh in itself. And sometimes Paul is being read in this sense. The sinful sarx. Yep. 15 verse 39, please. Now you see in that, okay, let's get in all the Bible text, then I'll say more. So there's that. The next one is the body itself as that's seen as composed of spirit, right, pneuma, in opposition to sort of lower faculties, right, in opposition to the body. Composed of matter in contrast to spirit. So Romans 2:28. Somebody else can take, if you just indicate so that we don't have the constant confusions. Who takes Romans 2:28? Yeah, okay, Mikey takes that. 2 Corinthians 7 verse 5. Okay? And Colossians 2 verse 5. Okay. Now, what you find here is a sort of, it would look like a certain, first of all, locating the weaknesses of the body and kind of a downplaying of it. We can even go further to see more of that contrast between flesh and spirit. I think a well-known one. The Paul Romans 12:1, of course, shows the body as this part of us that needs sanctification, isn't it? That needs to be, in a way, brought along in the journey of sanctification, where there's a spiritual man, but he must present the body for sanctification. Romans 12:1-2, we know that text well, so we skip that. 1 Corinthians 7:37. we can start, for example, by maybe pushing back a little bit scripturally on any sense that would perhaps read in the constant opposition that Paul makes between the spiritual man, between the spiritual and the flesh. That he's never there saying that inherently of itself the flesh is the sinful aspect of man in itself, right? And that the spirit is the saved aspect. But instead, Paul will talk about being, for example, carnally minded and spiritually minded, right? He will talk instead of an orientation of the whole man to either to the spiritual or to the carnal, to the fleshly. He will talk about a life according to the flesh, right? Or to live according to the Spirit. So instead of seeing in the separation between flesh and spirit, instead of seeing some kind of dualism of the one is the evil side, right, and the other is the spiritual side of man, what Paul has instead is an orientation of the whole man, either to being more spiritually minded or to being more carnally minded. So there's a different definition. Paul is outside the sort of dualism of flesh is bad, spirit is good. In fact, Paul will talk in some place about the mind of the flesh. Think about that construct for a while. In Romans 8, verse 7, he talks about the mind of the flesh. Phronema te sarkos. A mind of the flesh, and therefore there can be a mind of the spirit. So what role then this means does the mind controlling the whole play vis-a-vis sin? That's what is in perspective here. So all to say that our fleshly component is not in itself sinful in any special way that our spiritual component is not. Does that make sense? They are, like we saw yesterday, sinful in basically to the same extent because it pertains to the whole man. So we are definitely going to come back to Romans 7, but definitely the several times in Paul he's emphasizing, he can zoom in on some aspects in terms of what sin or what family of sins he's addressing. And so one way to see that is that in that very occasion, he's talking specifically of sins of the flesh or sins that issue more immediately from flesh. Another way of seeing that is to say that he's looking at that in terms of sins that results because of the fleshly orientation of the me that he's that's the subject there. Nothing good dwells in me, that is in my flesh. So that the my that is qualifying, that is me as oriented to the flesh. Either way, one sees in Paul that he's not to be read so strongly dualistically. So the main opposition, again, is not the main opposition is not between just flesh and spirit as much as it is between being spiritually oriented or being fleshly inclined. And then there is also the question of what role the will plays in turning either way, right? And of course, sanctification then is the growth in being spiritually minded, spiritually turned. Now, in being spiritually minded, we're not losing, of course, our flesh, but the flesh component is being sanctified, is being brought under subjection, as Paul says, but through the Spirit, not through the sort of ascetic practices that others use. So, sins of the flesh, etc. Okay, now we come to the more touchy issue for systematic theology. Is sin God's design? That was an earlier question, early in the day, in the morning. Does God will sin? So we're saying, okay, first of all, in his holiness, God is without sin, absolutely. And we spoke to that at the beginning of the day. But now the question is, clearly, in his created order, there is sin, right? Now, if we've been affirming that as part of the nature of God, or part of what we know to be as God has revealed himself to us, that he's all-powerful, nothing can happen without him allowing it. Does this mean then that he has, or actually we can say it more strongly, nothing happens without him willing it? Surely sin has happened. Does God will sin? Is it part of his design? Depending on how you answer that question, the follow-up question then is, so if you answer yes, for example, then how are we to conceive of the way, the modality in which God allows for the presence of sin? Should we talk of it in terms of active, immediate willing of it? Should we talk in terms, as some theologians have done, in terms of permission? And what are the problems involved in this? This is an exam question. If we're taking an exam, this will be one of the questions in all the breakdowns. And then you have, let's say, 1 hour, or actually 90 minutes to write a short essay on that. We mustn't think about sin just so in an abstract way. We need to think about sin in the weightiness of the evil that it is, in the ugliness that it is, in the destructive force that it is. Now, when we think about it, and not just personal individual sins, but how through sin has come death, right? Through sin has come untold suffering. Through sin has come all kinds of, let's just call it unfortunate things. When we start seeing it in the weightiness of sin, is it easy enough to say that God, in allowing the possibility of it, is able to show his love? Because if you're in one of the big consequences of sin, like you've lost your child and you're thinking you have the existential crisis where even your belief in God is shaken, and you're asking the question, why did God even, and you know this comes because of sin, and you're asking yourself, why did God even allow this kind of things? And somebody says, no, he's showing his love. What love? Yeah? So, for those who are redeemed, yes? Even when they're still suffering in the consequences of sin. Good engagement. The reason I'm trying to bring some of this is that we are right at the center of what theologians call a theodicy. Right? A defense of God. That how can you square the evil nature of things around us with the goodness and all power of God? Especially considering that when you are right in the middle of it, no easy conceptual answer, explanation would do. In fact, you're not even in the presence of mind to appreciate any of these arguments. So, but surely, at some point, our minds, our spirits still are asking for an answer, right? That this sin, in its origin, how does it square with the will of God? Do you ever have any idea at the back of your mind that, clearly God has allowed it, right? We can say that much. Otherwise, it won't be here. Now, how are we to make sense of this allowing? What is the relation of sin to the will of God? We said earlier at the beginning of our lecture in the morning that sin doesn't fall outside the power or outside the governance of God. Then we also went on to say, and even outside this governance said broadly, we can break it down further. Outside God's knowledge, outside God's will. Let's take those two, for example. If it doesn't fall outside God's governance, it's within his power. If it's within his power, then it's within his willing. And therefore, God willed for sin to be present. Are you satisfied with this? God willed the presence of sin. And mind you, the will of God is not just one act in the past. It has to be a continuous granting for the thing to be. So in terms of the tense of the willing, the grammatical tense, we can't just say God that time willed for it and then he's now hands off. The doctrine of providence requires that there's a continuous active willing then, continuously of the sin. Are you satisfied? Are you happy with this? Or do you feel like a bit awkward to admit this? Welcome to reflection on the mystery of the divine nature. If everything comes back to God, even the things that look in opposition to God, how do we reconcile? So, for example, God hates sin. How do you square God hates sin with God wills sin? All coming back to his will. What do you think of the attempted resolution of those who say, okay, I grant that the will, I grant that God, in God's will, in the end, he has to have willed everything because in his power. But we need to make some distinctions between an active will, an active willing, and a permissive will. And so seeing that a permissive will is a bit more it's a bit lighter. So, it's kind of I didn't will for the thief and the police guy, let's say. I didn't will for the thief to rob the gentleman, but then I kind of looked the other way when it was happening, for whatever reason, right? I had my gun, I have the authority to stop it, but I just looked the other way. Is that person morally culpable? How about they're not the police, but they have a gun, and they know very well they could have intervened and done something. They saw it happening, and maybe for whatever reason felt, man, I can't be bothered with this today, not today. So they look the other way. Are they morally, not legally, is there any sort of moral culpability that you'd find? Right. So if you have the power to do something and you allow it to happen, you have the power to stop something, but somehow you allow it to happen, you are culpable. It comes back to you.
You're not responsible.
What if you're on the way to catch a flight or something? I don't know. You're on your way to drop your sister at the airport.
I think there's
What happened? Huh? And now you've got to take care of this baby. There are many things you should be doing. It's like the Good Samaritan issue. There are all these people waiting for me at the temple. I've got duties to perform. This an inconvenience. Man. How about that? No, but I think you're on course here. Let's even intensify this, because this is infinitely intensified by considering the God of all flesh, with whom nothing happens in the world without his will in it. At least we can say so much. What the people who speak about the permissive will of God are trying to do is to grant that there is a willing, but try to find a softer version, a kind of more passive version of the willing. So to say God is not immediately and actively, he's not the immediate active subject in the sin. Of course, that's the will of man and all that. And so we talk about it as in terms of him permitting it, a kind of negative willing. Now, this has enjoyed some popularity, this way of looking at it, in many circles. When I was first growing up, this early in theology, this was the way I was taught and how I used to think about it, that we have to make a number of distinctions in God's will. But then in the end, it still comes back to this question that if, especially as God, if you just so-called permit, it's still an act of the will. He's still willing to permit. This negative willing is still willing. For example, in the case we're looking at, the person, by not doing anything, you rightly said, doesn't, especially in light of his goodness, his moral stance, doesn't absolve him, because he has clearly made some decision not to be involved with something, a course of events he's very much aware of. So God wills to permit sin. And in the case of evil, it even becomes more potent. God wills to permit evil. How about evils, like, for example, evils where there's no human agent? So it will not be as easy as saying, oh, it's the active agent is in the person, the human person. How about bigger evils like disasters, where we don't discern any immediate human agency? It then can be said, God wills to permit that. Are we satisfied with this? And can we move on? Or do you want to absolve the Almighty some more? Yes. Mm-hmm.
What is the difference?
Between active and permissive? Yeah, that's what we're saying, that it's not a real distinction. We're saying this, that we've proposed this permissive will because of our sense that something doesn't sit right. So we're trying to make some distinction. But in the final analysis, this doesn't seem like a real category, permissive will. Because even if you say permission, finally, especially with God, it still has to be an act of his will to permit. Also, considering that if God is true, if everything truly is within the governance of God, and if that governance means he knows it all and he wills it all, then even a permissive will doesn't do anything for this awkward theological feeling. I think the inference you make from the example has already, let's say it like economists, has already passed the elasticity of the analogy. In other words, the conclusion you just drew, the analogy has already broken down, because you don't grant for that person's actions. You're not the one who makes possible this person's actions in the final analysis, right? So yes, same limitation with what I was given as well. And in that case, I was just trying to use it to exemplify the awkwardness we feel in saying God is the author of sin. In this case, of course, the situation with God is very different in the sense that God is the one who grants for this person to perform every action, who grants the possibility for him to perform every action he ever performs. This person lives and moves and has his being in God. This person cannot act, cannot do anything, cannot take the breath that he woke up that morning with before he does anything he does without God willing it. Right? So, now, is there some distinction in culpability at the human level? Absolutely. And perhaps even at the divine level, and that's the whole enterprise of theodicy, isn't it? Is to say that even if at the highest level that God has to be the one that grants for anything to happen, that between there and the events, that there are more active agents to whom more moral culpability should be placed anyway, at least at the ethical sphere. Part of the difficulty with all of this is especially when you're dealing with cosmic evils, because in the end, who is the agency there, right? Some natural disasters, happens and hundreds of thousands of people die. Then it's like, did they sin so badly that they had to be punished in this way? What wrong did they do to deserve this sort of? So those sort of questions, theological, metaphysical questions that coming up. I'm in no way saying there's some easy way of answering this at all. But these questions come up in the discussion of the origin of sin. So does God permit, and is permitting, the language of permitting, good enough for us, for these difficulties? Let's see some scripture. For example, some of the things people could look at and say, wow, this is a hard saying, who can hear it? Places where we see that it sometimes makes us cringe and squirm, that, man, God is doing these sort of things. Exodus 7, verse 3. What does God do there to Pharaoh? He hardens his heart. He's hardening the guy's heart when he knows very well that he needs his heart to soften, so he will let his people go. He's hardening Pharaoh's heart. Okay. Look at 2 Samuel 16, verse 10. Good. And could you read also verse 24, verse 1? Again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he incited David against them. He incited David against them. There was another one I had in mind. Perhaps better still, let's go to the New Testament. The classic one, Romans 9. Romans 9:17. Remember how in that chapter he talks about how God has fitted some as vessels of his wrath. And here clearly what he does with Pharaoh, he basically sets him up. In one sense, he's hardening his heart. In another sense, he's here I have no better theological way of saying this, giving the guy a beating. He's setting him up, hardening his heart, and then striking him. Yeah? Definitely, we have to, first of all, in humility, appreciate and tremble, in fact, at the all power of God. And in instances like this, like these in Scripture, we see how, first of all, evil is so not beyond God, to the extent that he can order it to his own purposes, right? Now, what does this then mean? That evil doesn't have a positive identity of its own, that it all just comes to God? No. However, what we see instead is more the sort of governance, the ordering of God over evil to his purposes. And that whole of Romans 9, of course, is the sort of classic place, especially in view of salvation. Maybe we'll see some of it tomorrow. There's a kind of explanation that is given by some theologians. Actually, Bavinck pushes this a bit. An attempted explanation by saying that sin or evil is not the substance of God's act, but it's the accident of God's act. Now remember, many times we saw some of this yesterday, the difference between substance and accident. Yeah. It's a very philosophical explanation, a philosophical attempt at making sense of the way, of a philosophical way to conceive of the kind of distinction to be made. I think it even moves in the same direction as those who are trying to push for a permissive will in God. Let me read the section, then I explain it. Baving says, when a murderer kills somebody, all the planning ability and the power he needs for that purpose come from God. That's ultimately, right? But the act, from a formal point of view, is his, that is the murderer's, not God's. Indeed, the fact of homicide taken by itself is not yet a sin. And by this he means, for the same thing frequently occurs in war and on the scaffold. I see lots of building around. It's possible that somebody doing work in there and all that falls, drops dead. God forbid, but that could happen. Do we say God killed him? Do we say that? Even though many superstitious beliefs would say he did something sometime. Or his karma is speaking now. Anyway, what makes homicide a sin is not the matter, that is the substrate, but the form, that is the depravity, the lawlessness, anomia of the deed. So not the substance, but the accident in the act. Do you understand what distinction is being made? Or do you want me to illustrate that a bit?
Just maybe more.
A little bit, okay. Is this Aristotelian idea that for everything there is a core, the essence of the thing, the substance of the thing, and then there are the accidents. In other words, there is the matter of the thing, there's the specificity of the thing, and then there's the general form of the thing. So what Bavinck is drawing at here is to say that in a way we can think of sinful acts in the sense that broadly speaking, in the final analysis, the conditions under which everything happens, generally speaking, broadly speaking, the conditions all come back to God. Or actually, I have a better idea here. Generally speaking, the conditions for anything to be possible all come to God. The guy who killed somebody, what are the various conditions that you can say need to be in place for you to go out and kill somebody? Say? Motive? Yes. You have to have the desire, okay. The strength, the know-how, opportunity, means, to be at the right place, right time. The intelligence has to be there. Yeah, there's some bad killers and there's some good killers. Yes. You've watched your CSI. Yes. So there's all these things, and all these things God makes possible. So this is why we can say in the broadest general sense. But what has this to do with God being the author of that act? So the explanation being given here is that in the broad sense, yes, God comes to God. But the specificity of the thing, the reason why all these things have come together in that way, has to do with that person. Because we could also conceive of all these conditions that do not result in murder. The same guy could be intelligent, the same guy could have opportunity, the same guy could have the means, the same guy, and still not kill the person. Because he says, oh no, it's not worth it, that's not me, whatever reason. Or he's about to do it and then somebody just strolls by and it's like, oops, right? Or he's about to do it, he has second thoughts. Or he's about to do it and somebody calls him on the phone with a better proposal. Whatever. Whatever happens. So this is the sort of, the kind of difference. There's a formal aspect, and he's using this case of homicide. There's a formal aspect, a formal point of view. That's the act itself. That aspect belongs to the person who does it. It's not God's. God is not the author. Now in this case, if the guy changes his mind, I'm not necessarily saying God intervened. I'm saying that it's possible that even given all those conditions that we say God is the one who allows, he makes him breathe, he makes him alive, all those things, that even given those conditions, it's not necessary that it results in that, if not that there is another principle, which Bavinck is calling a formal principle, the formal act. In other words, according to Aristotelian metaphysics, which all your reformers are schooled in, all your medieval theologians are schooled in, most of your church fathers are schooled in. According to this principle, this metaphysics, we can speak of two aspects of anything, absolutely. There's the matter and there's the form. Matter means, this Greek word, the hule, which means something completely indefinite. So matter, don't think like modernists, which we think matter is little atomic, subatomic now. Particles, no. Matter just means complete indefiniteness. But that indefiniteness becomes particularized by a form, right? It gets informed into something specific. So, and this is what these guys are doing here. They're saying, in a sense, this broad indefiniteness of all the conditions that God allows can be seen here, but that the informing, the formal aspect of the actual act, the individuation of it, this is the center here, this will of somebody, so that this person is culpable for sure, and that God is not, even though God grants, and that nothing happens without God's enabling it, even, we could say. It doesn't mean that God is the formal author of the sin. Now, does this explanation satisfy? Not necessarily. Depending on how much metaphysical explanations mean to you. And so we need to think the principle that's being explained, and then we can find different ways of having that kind of discussion, especially, for example, in pastoral contexts. So if somebody is grieving and thinking that God is not a good God because their child died, and you tell them he's not the author of the formal aspects of his they'll chase you out of the house. So the important thing is the principle. What is being defended is a theological point that the Bible explicitly says God is not the author of iniquity. In him there is no sin. There was a question here. No, it's not saying that. But it's saying that as much as everything ultimately comes to God, when we're talking about sin, especially in its moral, ethical aspects that requires an agency, an active, immediate agency, that is that person's will. Now, you remember when we started class and we listed the various meanings and angles on sin, and I pointed out how most of the list was sins that require agency, immediate agency. So that is that. I think the big difficulty comes when we start talking about sin in terms of nature, in terms of the nature of sin, i.e., by no fault of your own, by no actual commission of your own, you find yourself as inheriting something that has already damned you. Is that what they call it? Yeah? No, it's true, but I just didn't want to say it so we don't just give the term without appreciating the substance in there. It's unfair. Yes? That you are not given a proper chance yourself. Right? Some guy was the one who decided your fate. And how much can you say, actually, I wish I were given my own chance, given a shot at this. If I were Adam, if I were Eve, I would not have done this. If I were Adam, I would have stayed next to my wife. And when she wanted to eat the apple, I'll hit it from her hand and say, no, don't touch it. Even better. Okay, let's say this. Since the narrative is trying to tell us to account for how this sin and death comes onto him, and therefore everything in him, that's fine. Let's say he asks for forgiveness, please help us, and okay. We don't know. But the important thing is that the sting of death and of sin has happened already. Now, of course, it's up to God, and he does indeed eventually forgive him, doesn't he? But now it's up to God how long that's going to take. And we feel every time it takes long. So all I'm saying is that, okay, fine, but I think definitely the sense of the text and what it's telling us is precisely, will this sin come onto man, this evil come onto man or not? And whether God forgives or doesn't forgive is a second issue. But the sin and death do come onto him. And it opens up another kind of history. Yeah? Mikey had a question. So in that case, you wouldn't believe in the real sense of freedom. Because that would be the only difference. After all these things you're saying, we control for all of that. The only difference for a different individual in the same circumstances would be freedom. Now it's the question of, is there freedom to the extent that if you control all the external circumstances, that you can still have a different outcome? Because if no, then there's no freedom. Let me pull us back to where we were. we were talking about how it feels unfair that we're not given a good shot individually. And perhaps this is why the British monk Pelagius was attractive to many, because there was a sense of justice there. Because he's saying at every instance, everybody is really neutral. You get your own shot. Maybe you don't do right, that's fine, but you get a chance. It's not based on just the decision of Adam that suddenly you're just born into a nature that you can do nothing about, at least certainly not in your strength. So, yeah, I kind of like Pelagianism, one would think, right? Except that's not the truth. That's not the truth. If you really, really look at, and we can move forward here, if you really look into your own heart, if we really take seriously the way Scripture portrays the holiness of God, and how that in the best efforts and best we could do, he's still seeing it as filthy rags, then you start saying that in the end we're faced more with a question of what's happened in this Adam vis-a-vis our nature. That the bigger issue here is the question of nature or of concupiscence. That we're already born with some serious inclination to sin, even after being redeemed, right? We're going to see, we'll read together Romans 7. And then we can start understanding the constant cry of Paul, wretched me. Something has to be done about this nature. Okay, we take a break, we come back, we talk about what Yapsega had said about the possibility of sin as God's will, because I think this is one of the good explanations that what we find in God's will is sin as possibility. Again, mind you, we're trying to use what Scripture says, to try to construct and make sense, to sort of try to penetrate into the intelligibility of what has been revealed. So none of these explanations are definitive, I would say. But some make a better case of the scriptural text more than others.